700 years ere seed sown. Truth was twisted, its seeds were grown. Break the lies, spark the mission. Welcome to Quranic Inquisition.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the show. Peace of the Lord to all of you. Shalom, assalamu alaikum, namaste, and all peaceful greetings to you. So, welcome. We are now right after doing the first very themed 10 streams that we completed last week. And now we're going to start going through different verses, different words, different topics. So these next sessions are not going to be themed. We just pick something that we think is interesting for you to know, things that we have noticed, some questions and some answers as always. And today we don't have Cash with us. We have the Cash twins. We have two with us. So how are you doing, Cash?
Good. I'm feeling so good. I multiplied myself like kind of like an amoeba or something like this. I'm doing well. How are you, JC?
I'm good. I'm good. Looking forward to today's show.
Yep. So today we're trying to be more quick here. We're gonna look at just one word, a little bit of speculation, a little bit of looking at different roots, what they would mean, and trying to make sense of a very interesting verse in the Quran. In fact, this thematic of Allah being the best of the makr. This comes in multiple instances, but this is one verse that is just an example of such. And that's what we're going to be looking at today with this question of the makr word, because what we're told essentially from the standard Islamic narrative is that this root MKR, and it is attested very early. I double checked in the Kitab al-Ain. This is the first Arabic dictionary that we have attested in history. And even back then, which was, I think, something in the 9th century, so we're still late when it comes to the first Arabic dictionary. But as early as that, we already have this meaning and scope of deceiver, plotter, schemer, conspirer. And because the root is used in the context of speaking about God, it turns the verse essentially into a kind of Loki style figure. And that's always rubbed, I guess, people the wrong way, especially Christians, to hear the idea that their God, or the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is a schemer or a deceiver or a tricker, because we know that the father of lies is the devil, and God does not lie. He is faithful to his covenants, to his promises, and he doesn't scheme. So the question becomes, okay, what's going on here with this MKR root in this verse? So we've explored already in the series how effectively reading the Quran as if it's an Arabic text is the fundamental conceit. And the conceit is that once you accept that, then you've already accepted the redefining of words effectively, where essentially the Arabic language evolves from the Quranic text. And however, as we've already seen, the Quranic textual tradition is not itself an Arabic textual tradition. It is derived from the Aramaic, primarily the Syriac, with heavy influences from the Hebrew itself, Old Testament. So that's a very interesting aspect. It's worth noting all these different influences in terms of the loanwords used. We've got a lot of heavy usage of the Syriac in the loanwords, which makes sense because Syriac was the liturgical, theological language of the time and region. So it would make sense to heavily rely and take from the Syriac in terms of words. However, we also have Hebrew loanwords as well as Ethiopic, Gez loanwords, as well as some other languages less attested. But those are the primary loans. So it's worth noting that those roots would then therefore be relevant for an analysis of the MKR root. So let's have a look at in the Quran itself the question of this MKR root usage. This is a lot more verses than we're going to go through. We're just going to hyper focus on Surah 3, Ayah 54. But as we can see here, it's very consistently translated. This is from corpus.quran. And here we can see it's either translated as scheme or plan or plot. So we have, three words. They carry effectively the same meaning. They're all derived from the MKR root. And it stays faithful to the Kitab al-Ain rendering of the semantic scope of the Arabic MKR, to effectively have this meaning of plotting, scheming, conspiring, planning. And it can be positive. You can plan something for good, but this kind of inherent meaning in the MKR root is quite negative, as it is associated with trickery and deceptiveness, rather than having a neutral or a positive association to the root. So it's pretty consistently rendered in the Arabic, and it'll be worthwhile to go through essentially all of them and look at the context of the verses to find what, let's say, scope of meaning this root can hold. So to continue, let's have a look at just some of these examples of the verses. So we have 354, which is the one we're focusing on, and that is traditionally rendered, it's traditionally rendered, we can see here, according to the standard Islamic narrative translation. So from Mustafa Khattab, we have, and the disbelievers made a plan, and then we see in brackets against Jesus, and Allah also planned, and Allah is the best of planners. So you have this, they makkard, but God makkard too, and God is the best of the makkarin. So it uses the root 3 times in the verse. They do something, God also does that, yet God is the best of that. So he's better at whatever this mocker is than they are, the kafir, the disbelievers, those who deny Christ. So to have a look at,
Is this,
sorry?
just checking, is this the one that particularly Christian apologists say often that it also means the best of deceivers? Is it exactly the same word, or the deceiver one is a different one?
No, this is exactly the right word. So this is, makar comes up a lot in apologetics and polemics, discussions between Christians and Muslims, and anyone and Muslims for that matter, because their sources and their Arabic dictionaries, they are the ones that define this makar word as being trickery, deception. It's essentially sort of underhanded tactics to achieve an end. It's that kind of idea of planning, conspiring, plotting, and of course, like you were sort of pointing out, deceiving as well is included in that semantic scope. So that's why it is pointed out as one of these verses where the question becomes, okay, do you worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or do you worship the God of Loki, who is this trickster figure who deceives people and so on? So that becomes the central question of, is this true that this religious scripture is using a word for God, which is restricted to plot, scheme, deceive, this kind of idea? Is that really what the authors were intending when they were describing God with that root? What I'm going to put forward in this presentation today is to emphasize once again that we should not be restricting ourselves and our understanding to the standard Islamic narrative, and not even to the Arabic language itself, because the Arabic language came out of the text, which originally wasn't an Arabic text, and therefore the language simply became what was necessary for it to mean, which is a whole wild thing in itself. But that's the point, is that we're going to be reading this with a nuanced understanding that this potentially was in a multilingual environment where the liturgical Syriac was in use, where the authors, we're going to go into this in another stream, where the text is very familiar with the Talmudic stories. So therefore, it comes from a Judaic point of view, presumably, and that would then, make sense of the fact that there's some Hebrew loan words. So we should also be looking at the meanings of the root in Hebrew, as well as the Syriac and so forth. So I'm just going to go through a couple verses here, just as an examples of other verses where we see the root. So we see in Surah 6, verse 123, and thus we rendered in every settlement its largest of criminals to scheme in it, and they do not scheme except by themselves and do not feel. So we see this idea, it's repeated there also, that they are scheming. So it's something that the promote, the ultimate they, the outgroup, the denier, the disbeliever, that they are, this is something that they do. Okay, and then we see, of course, that Allah also does this. And we can see then on the bottom of the screen here in Surah 8:30, and those who covered scheme by thee, to stabilize thee, or have to move this other way, or to kill thee, or bring thee out, and they scheme, and Allah schemes, and Allah is the most charitable of schemers. So it's very interesting how the word charitable, we're seeing that in the murad here as well. It doesn't really make sense even on its own, like just let's say for a standalone, to have a charitable schemer. So it seems on face value there's something off with this MKR root. Why is it a negative root that's being applied to God? How do we make sense of this? So in order to do that, what I propose is that I'll just skip through here. We can see, essentially you saw in the first image where we had the consistent attestation of having plot or scheme in its usage. I'm not going to go into detail of all these verses and read them out. You can have a look through here and also look through the Murad translation in your own time. You can search for the word scheme. That's the one that Murad consistently renders the MKR root as. So you can have a look at some of the context and see. However, it's too expansive to look at all verses, so we're going to focus on Surah 3, Ayah 54 for the sake of this shorter form look at this MKR root. So we have all the different translators here. They effectively translate, well, they translate all a little bit differently, but the general theme is the same. It's either scheming or planning. That's applied to them, the disbelievers, and then it also applies to God. And this is the verse here. I'm putting an image here so we can look at it also in context directly from the Murad. I'm going to read starting from verse 52 here in Surah 3. It starts with this. So, as soon as Isa sends covering from them, and covering here can mean denying. This is the KFR root. So you can think of it as those who deny the correct way of being or believing according to the authors, which would be to believe in Christ in their own way, but believe in Christ. So as soon as Isa sends covering from them, he said, who are my advocates unto Allah? The Hawariyun, which in this Hawariyun is referring to the disciples. It uses the root hur, which means white. And this would make sense, presumably because they are white and pure and clean because Jesus washes them, presumably. The Hawariyun said, we are advocators of Allah, and we have believed by Allah and bear witness that we are the submitters, or we are submitters. We continue reading. Our Lord, we have believed by what thou hast descended, and we have followed the messenger. Who is the messenger in this context? It's Isa, obviously. So write us with the witnesses. So that's obviously the idea of, being on the list of those who believe in Christ and therefore are in the book of life. We continue reading, and this is the key verse here. So in the context, we're talking about Isa, we're talking about belief, the proper belief, the proper submission, and that the Hawariyun are now submitting in accordance with what the author is presenting here. And then we read in the context of that, and they schemed, and Allah schemed, and Allah is the most charitable of schemers. So in context, we should understand that whatever scheming or whatever MKR, whatever makr is going on here, it's in the context of Jesus, it's in the context of the Hawariyun submitting to him. Here, we continue here. And then we continue reading, and Allah, as Allah said, O Isa, so again, it's about Isa, surely I am fulfilling thee to myself. So this is how another idea is being integrated in here. And this is the idea of the early Ishmaelites, or even as such in the text, they do not believe that the divinity, however you want to think of it as a Christian, so you could potentially sort of see it in a Nestorian lens for the sake of practicality here and say, okay, there's a divine nature, there's a human nature, and the authors here separate them, but go also a step further and say they're separated, not mixed at all, and therefore the divine nature didn't suffer at all on the cross. In fact, the divine, or both natures presumably, were fulfilled, or it's not actually very clear necessarily what's going on here. But we see that in context, Isa is being fulfilled thee to myself and raising thee unto me, so raised up to God, and purifying thee from those who covered, to purify him from those who denied or denied him, denied God, and rendering those whom followed thee above those who have covered. This is unto the day of standing straight, which is Judgment Day. And Christian apologists cite verses like this. I think it appears in other contexts as well, where it's clearly about those who follow Jesus, the Hawariyun in this context, are going to be uppermost until the day of judgment. Your returning place is unto me, so I will judge between you and what you are varying. So this is we also have verses talking about they were of one understanding until knowledge came to them. And in that context, it's talking about the coming of Jesus, and that being the event that really splits, bifurcates the Jewish understanding of their religion, right? So you have those who accept Messiah and don't accept Messiah. So anyway, that's the context we're dealing with here in this verse here. It's about the story of Jesus, it's about the Hawariyun, and it's about Allah, or it's about them scheming or makring However, God doing that same thing, that same verb, that same word, that God is also doing that, and that He is the most charitable of those who do that. So, I'd like to ask you, JC. So, what do you get generally so far, about based on the context we've read and what we're sort of looking at here for this verse 54?
Well, what I get is that it was always a confusing word because it's one of the first ones that I heard people such as Jay Smith mentioned as the best of deceivers. And it was surprising because I would consider that to be an insult to God. Who would call God a deceiver? I mean, if you want a one-way ticket to hell, probably yeah, follow that approach and call him that. It's an insult, and I had seen it in movies and stuff that one of the titles they use for Satan is like the great deceiver or the best, well, the great deceiver, and so there was something there that actually didn't fit, and certainly the meaning is something else. Maybe the word is what it is, we know it's maker, but the way I see it is a bit like you have different words in different countries, even in English, where you have the same word in one country means one thing, and then in another country it means something else. And you can understand pretty much everything in a sentence if you are born in the UK and then you go to the US, there will be some words that are actually American. So they are not the ones that you are using. Maybe to you they mean something else, but you kind of understand it based on the context. And I think this is what we have here. We have a context that implies, well, something is going on there, but the meaning for for the people who wrote it was very nice, very benign. And then for the people who inherited the word, in this case, the early Muslims, it became something rather nasty. So the word being the same, but the meaning being different. So this is like my thoughts so far.
Nice, nice. So one thing I would like to point out, especially, is the usage of a word twice, especially the fact that it's being used both to describe they and to describe Allah. And we're told, according to the traditions, that Allah is unlike anything in creation. However, in this verse, it's actually comparing Allah in their capacity to do X, which is makr, right? It's saying that it's comparing Allah to creation in the shared capacity between them, they, and Allah to quote unquote scheme or makr. And that's already a huge problem. So what I would propose is the same way that you might use, it's a terrible example in my mind, but I guess here's an example in the English for to use the same root or the same word twice in a sentence to describe God and the disbelievers, let's say, it fits that that would have a dual punny usage. So, for example, if I would say he was slain and he slew, or I don't know, like you know how slay in the modern vernacular, like white girls can say slay girl or whatever, so it can have a different meaning. Terrible example, but you can think of other ones where you have one word that can be repeated twice, and because that word has multiple meanings, it's quite profound, and you can sort of use it in a punny sense and say, they slew, but God slew, and maybe has a dual usage. It was a terrible example, but you can understand the direction of this. Is that if you do use the same word in the verse twice to apply it to the disbelievers and to God, it would seem reasonable to assume that the word itself has at least two meanings, such that you're not actually describing God by comparing him to creation insofar as he schemes like creation schemes. So, what do you think, JC, on a base level of unlike anything in creation, it seems like that has a problem in and of itself, right?
Well, the thing is, we hear that from the Islamic traditions that Allah is unlike anything else in creation. But when you are actually reading the Quran and then you're reading the Hadith, they break that rule like every single time. Like they keep comparing Allah to everything. So it's like, yeah, take it with a pinch of salt. It's almost like they wanted to tell people Allah is completely different to anything. You cannot even assign words that you assign to humans. And then you read, and he has a shin and two hands, two right hands, and the whole thing. So I wouldn't actually read too much into that, and I would just interpret that as them using hyperbole more than trying to actually be accurate and describe Allah when they don't know Him. But in terms of the words, I know what you are saying. The way that I think this works, and particularly because I have seen the rest of the slides already, is that the meaning of the word means at the moment schemer or deceiver, and it's like, okay, that's fine, and that's how it is understood in Arabic and also in English. But that word actually means something else. Like in the real sense, it doesn't mean, okay, so he's tricking them into doing something. It actually is that word, but it means something a lot softer and something that would make us go, ah, actually that makes sense. Now I understand what it means, and it's not an insult. Another thing that I will just add is this verse that you have just pulled up. So as Allah said, "O Isa, surely I am fulfilling thee to myself and raising thee unto me." That verse used to be translated by Google Translate as Allah said to Isa, "I am, I will cause you to die and raise you to myself." Now it just gives the translation from, I think is Daif International, but I did try this like a year ago, and it was saying that I've heard as well Sam Shamoun actually pulling Muslims up on this particular verse by saying this verse actually confirms that Jesus died. So, but anyway, that one is a conversation for another time. Anyway, looking forward to see what this great deceiver actually was accomplishing.
JC, was that translation of this the example that you showed me where the Google Translate actually translated with the bracketology involved?
I don't think that they use bracketology. I think this one is one that Google Translate. Oh, no, no, you are actually speaking about a different case where they actually inserted
Okay.
in brackets, "O Muhammad." No, this one is one that it used to just translate basically word for word and what that whole sentence means. But now, if you punch in the Arabic into Google Translate, it's just going to give you Daif International. We have this on the channel, on the, what is it called? One second. There is this section for posts. So there is a post where I actually copy and pasted that particular result. So anyone who is watching, if you don't know what I'm talking about, go. There are only a couple of posts. I think we've only done two because we were just testing that. And you can have a look how it used to be in Google Translate and what Google Translate does now. And just before we forget, because we always do, thank you for being here, guys, by the way. So please feel free to give us a like and a sub if this is your first time on the channel. It really help us, and maybe we'll get more people interested in this material. So, but
Back,
that's that.
back
Over
to the
to you,
regular
Tash.
scheduled content. Sorry, what?
Over to you.
Okay, so just looking here, so we have this our context established in this verse here. It's about Isa. It's about being fulfilled up to himself. So it's related to the question of the passion, the story of the passion. So it's related to the crucifixion. The way it's translated scheme. Okay, presumably in the whole grand scheme of things, well, the sin would explain like this, and it sort of does make sense, and at least in the context that it's talking about the betrayal of Judas and them scheming behind the back to kill him. However, Allah is scheming better, and therefore Allah fulfills Isa to himself and saves him from those who covered. So that's the traditional rendering, and how we can frankly make sense of any of it, given the whole scheme, deceive, trick, plot rendering for the Makkah root. So when it comes to this root, now let's look at some Syro-Aramaic and Hebrew material. To start off, let's go back to the very, very original, which of course is the Old Testament usage of the root. So this is the usage of the MKR root in the Hebrew language itself. So what we're looking at here is from blueletterbible.org. It's the lexicon for the MKR root. And as you can see there on the bottom, the primary and stable usage of the root is about selling. So it can be a verb to sell. You can make it you can make it a noun, a seller. You can and different conjugations. You get different forms, but the fundamental meaning is to sell. You can also use it for to be given over to death, which is interesting because if we did apply that just in the case of our verse in question, then we would be dealing with potentially, and they sold, and Allah gave himself to death, and he's the most charitable of those who give themselves to death. But that's obviously not that's not the totality of what we should be understanding this verse as, but just to give a baseline understanding. So we have this primitive root. It means to sell. Okay, that's the Hebrew. you think of it as transferring ownership, and you'll see how that matters in how it's used in the Old Testament. It's going to be incredibly important. So the next question is the Aramaic. So this would be for the Aramaic, Syro-Aramaic, right? Because Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic. It takes most of its meanings, if not all of its meanings, from the Aramaic broadly. But anyway, so both in one basket. We're looking at the Syro-Aramaic here, and this is quite interesting. What happens here? So the root in the Hebrew originally had the idea of exchanging, ownership, legal transfer of ownership, selling, this kind of usage and this kind of meaning. And then in the Syriac, it takes on this meaning of marry or to betroth someone. You can obviously see how that would make sense, right? Because when you sell something, you're transferring ownership, and when you are you're betrothing your daughter, or right, your usually daughter, but maybe sister or whatever, right? When you're giving off your daughter or sister in marriage, it then would take on this meaning of to betroth them or to arrange a marriage, right? So that's what we see here as the primary use. However, we also still have the root primitive usage of to be sold for a price. You can see there. He was zealous for his eldest son, and he was not allowed to be sold away, right? So it retains its meaning of to sell, right? In the sense of betrothing your daughter is to sell her off, right? You could think of it that way. But it has this primary meaning of to betroth. And the reason why, I don't know why, but we see that this is a reality based on the Pauline letters in the Peshitta. So this is the Syriac translation of the New Testament. And the Old Testament, of course, too. It's the entire Syriac textual tradition of the Bible. That's the Peshitta. In the Peshitta, in the Pauline letters, we see Paul use the Makar root to refer to marriage as such. So when he's talking about giving you off to one husband, he uses the Makar root. So currently we have the baseline foundation, which then seems to be also retained as a secondary meaning in the Syriac and Aramaic here. So we have this idea of selling, we have this idea of betrothing, and they're both in parallel. They're both floating there potentially as meanings to draw from. And the reason I'm emphasizing that is that in an environment where you have Syriac speakers, you have Arabic speakers, nascent Arabic speakers, you have people who are speaking Hebrew or Judo-Arabic, and all these different these different language traditions, especially in a city like Edessa or any of these other Hira as well. You'd have a lot of different language traditions intermixing, as well as the liturgical use of Syriac. So if you were an Arabic speaker natively, you would also be liturgically familiar with Syriac if you were to be in the court of the caliph and so forth, right? So these meanings would all be in the air to draw upon, and you could use them in a pun sense to, like I was saying before, the way I would imagine in the context of God does X and humans do X, the only way to realistically sort of do that is where you have two meanings at the very least, such that the meaning that's applied to God is distinct from the meaning that's applied to humans. That way you maintain that God is unlike all of creation. Does that make sense, JC?
Yeah, it makes absolute sense. It's just that I know what comes next because I've seen the next slide, so I'm actually looking forward to actually getting to those ones. And this is just a comment from our friend from just a little bit ago, from like 15 minutes ago, and he was like pretty much in bang on the money. So yeah, it had to do something to do with money. In this case, it's about selling or betrothal or something where, say, a deed actually is changing hands. So pretty spot on.
Right. So in the context of this verse, at the very least, you could think of the idea of, yes. So the makar word is related to wealth in the sense of changing ownership of material possessions, to sell something. In regards to the word charitable, as we saw in the Murad, if I go back here, and we can have a look and highlight it, right? We have the most charitable of schemers, the most charitable of makarim. So in the context of that, what comes to mind personally when I hear that is the idea of grace, right? Charity, or to be charitable, is to give someone something that they don't deserve. And this is the idea of grace in Christianity and in Christ, where we gain, salvation, but also on top of that, we gain what we don't even deserve. So we don't get punished for what we deserve, that's salvation. And then we do get what we don't deserve, and that's grace. So for God to be called the most charitable of something it would ring this idea in my mind of grace as such, as a sort of a framework conceptual lens to see it through. So I would concur with that. So we've gotten through now the selling route. We've got through this idea of also being used in a dual sense for betrothal. So I want to make sure that's very emphasized. Here's an example of the Peshitta usage of makar root. So we see this was in an example. You can see they're betrothed you to one, I think it's one man, or to one bridegroom. Regardless, just as an example here, that way you can see it in use. This is the makar root used in the Pauline letters, specifically in 2 Corinthians in 11:2, where we see it used to mean betrothed. So we have this root, this foundational sense of to sell, and we have this evolved usage in the Syriac to mean betrothed. So interesting development. Just a quick sort of overview that we can see here as such, where it also includes some other meanings that I haven't looked at in the other slides. So to repeat, in the Hebrew, we have to sell, to hand over. We have different forms of it. It can be in a noun form, imperative, so on and so forth. It's primarily used in the context of commerce, slavery, which we'll see in a second, divine judgment metaphors. And in terms of the attestations, if I just, upsala, I am having a technical difficulty here. So we see the usage of the root in where Esau sells his birthright. So we see that used there. So it seems to talk about, you know, selling. He didn't really get, well, he got the porridge, I guess, for it, right? So, you know, it's an exchange, right? You're exchanging the porridge for the whole birthright. So this is seen in the context of Genesis 25. This is a great mistake by Esau. He's got a low time preference. He's got his priorities out of whack, right? So we see this makar word used there. Looking at the Syriac, like I said, we have betrothed, to give in marriage. Interestingly, we have this development of makriuta, which I found to mean craftiness. So you can see sort of a development that would make sense of cunning or scheming in the later Arabic standardization of the meaning of the root. Interestingly, I put here as well in the Gez, it seems that the root, it can also mean to advise or to counsel, which is very interesting. I just put it on here as a point of interest because I do think that there is a Ethiopia influence or Ethiopic Gez influence in this question of the emergence of Islam, which is a very interesting question for another stream. So we have all these usages and meanings. I'm not going to focus on the Gez because that gets a little crazy. But just for now, we're going to focus on what we would expect the author, given the fact that they're Talmudically familiar, given the fact that they're very Jewish in their outlook in terms of the content of the text. I would propose that it serves to reason that at least there has this influence of the Hebrew language and the Hebrew meaning of the root in the author's understanding of the word. I think that's fair to say. So here's the case for what I'm going to be making here about this usage of the MKR. So one thing is to see how the MKR root is used in the Old Testament. So for this, I'm looking at the Masoretic text of the Old Testament and the usage of the MKR root and how it's attested, essentially. And I explained how it means to sell, but it's important to see how it's used, right? To see what kind of connotations would make sense to evoke, right? So here in this verse here, we see, and I'll just read the translation we see here, and Midianite men, traders passed by, and they pulled and lifted up Joseph from the pit, and they sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph to Egypt. So, not to explain the whole story, what we have here is this story in the Old Testament of Joseph being sold off by his brothers into slavery to the Ishmaelites. Ishmaelites may or may not be, coincidental here, I would say, right? However, crucially, there is this seriously negative betrayal that occurs here with Joseph, that he is sold off, that ownership of him as a person is transferred off to the foreigner, to the Ishmaelite, to the Midianite men here who are traders who are passing by. He's sold off into slavery and taken into Egypt. And this is a large narrative in the Old Testament that culminates in the verse here that we see, which is then at the end of the story. I forget the exact reference to it. I should have had it included here. That's my bad. And we read in this verse, and you intended evil against me. This is Joseph speaking to his brothers. So after everything unfolds, Joseph is sold off into Egypt. As a result, he interprets the dreams of the court of the Egyptians, all the way working his way all the way up to the good graces of Pharaoh, and eventually attaining a very high position and marrying the daughter of the Pharaoh, if I recall correctly. So we have this this great betrayal by his brothers. He's sold off into Egypt, but as a result of it, everything sort of like goes well in a sense, right? Like if not for the brothers selling him into Egypt, he would have not found his wife, right? So that at the very least is a good that came out of it. But also beyond that, there's this exaltation of Joseph in Egypt here, and that's good for the Jewish people as well. So anyway, I'll read the verse here. This is Joseph speaking to his brothers after reconciling, I suppose, but this is the process of reconciling. Joseph says, "And you intended evil against me in selling him off to the Ishmaelites, but God intended it for good, to bring about the present result, to keep many people alive." So in the end, a good came from it, right? And I'm going to put forward that this is going to be important as a mirroring of the crucifixion, of the passion, and that this is the intention behind the author's usage of the root. That's going to be my suggestion. So, in the context of this verse, you can also see even potentially how the makar root then becomes this meaning of plan or scheme, because the conclusion of Joseph's makar to the Ishmaelites is this thematic of intention. So that's why we get this idea of planning evil or intended evil against me, but God intended or God planned it for good, right? So this idea of the divine plan, God's plan ultimately, this is what's sort of in question about does God have a plan? If people do evil in the world, does it ruin God's plan, or is God's plan beyond that? And this is kind of the idea I would put forward. So here's a slide where we can now discuss. So what I'm going to propose is that we should have a nuanced reading, especially given the fact that it's applied as a root to both humans and to God. Therefore, it ought to have this dual sense of the word. And what I would put forward is this mirroring, where you have Joseph, who is mocked by his brothers for 20 pieces or 30 pieces of silver. I don't know who got more, whether it was the brothers of Joseph or whether it was Judas. But you see this reflection. You have human beings acting, believing that they can sort of influence and they can scheme, they can sell people into slavery and whatnot. However, throughout all of that, while they were acting, while they were selling people into selling Joseph into slavery, or while Judas was selling Jesus to the Pharisees, regardless, God throughout the entire story maintained sovereignty and transformed, like we saw in the verse with Joseph. He transformed what was intended for evil into good. So what I'm going to put forward is we have this, like we can see in the image here, you have this sale of Joseph to Egypt into slavery, and how this betrayal, this humiliation occurs first, and then through that humiliation is the exaltation, or the exaltation, right, of Joseph to high position in the Egyptian society, finding his wife, and then saving many people at the end of the story, which we then see as being the true intent of God throughout the entire thing. So God's sovereignty was maintained, and you have this process of betrayal, humiliation, exaltation, and then redemption, symbolized by the marriage. So remember how I was emphasizing the marriage root in the context of the Syriac usage of the root as being evolved from simple sale. So they sold him away, like they sold him out, right? They mocked him, they sold him out. So again, remember we're in the context of the story of Jesus here, right? So the verse in question is sandwiched between two verses discussing the passion, effectively, with the reframing of fulfilling him to himself, right? So we have a little divergence there from orthodoxy, assuming this is the correct rendering of the intent of the author. So in the context, we have them scheming, or well, I guess I'm reading the Murad here, but them selling him out, right? And they sold him out. and Allah schemed as well. But what does it mean here again? This is the question. If we have schemed twice here, and we're going to rely on, let's say, the Hebrew and the Syriac, what would we read it as? And they sold, and Allah betrothed, potentially, where you have the dual usage, right? Because the idea would be that in the context of the story of Jesus is that they betrayed Jesus. However, despite all of that, God intended it for good, right? And the result of this betrayal is the marrying off of his son, right? God marries off his son as a result of this whole process unfolding. He marries off his son to the church. This is the belief of Christians. It's the belief of the New Testament. So you have this dueling. Like, everyone talks, and not everyone, but it's very often noted how Joseph is a messianic or pre-messianic sort of typology, where reflecting, especially as a Semitically minded author, to reflect and evoke this duality, to evoke the story of Judah, because that's the name of the brother who betrayed Joseph. Judah was the one who was spearheading the operation. So for Judah to betray Joseph and then God to transform that betrayal into a marriage would then parallel how Esau was sold out to the Pharisees, and yet God's sovereignty throughout the entire ordeal is to marry Christ off to all faithful believers. So that was what I would propose, in the sense that we have this tradition. We have attested that the tradition derives it's a lot of loan words, so it would have been familiar with the Syriac, it would have been familiar with the Hebrew to some extent. Therefore, it seems reasonable to assume that they would derive the dual usage of the root here for humans and creator, for creation and creator, would only make sense with at least a dual pun sense of the root. So deriving upon the usage of the Old Testament, the story and typology, however the word he would phrase it, of Joseph being mirrored here in then the betrayal of Judas. Judah betrays Joseph, Judas betrays Jesus. However, God transforms that selling off, selling out, betraying, conspiring, right? He transforms that into a marriage. He transforms that into a betrothal. And he is the most charitable of betrothers. I guess you could render it that way. Obviously, the proper rendering is simply the original language, which is they mocked, God mocked, and he's the most charitable of mockers. And we should understand that when they use the root here, mocker, they have this in mind. They have this multilingual pun sense of the dual usage in mind, and it would paint this picture of a really deep and profound intention of the author. The picture they're painting, the themes that they're evoking the story of Joseph. They're comparing Joseph being sold off with then people now in the modern day selling out Jesus or betraying Jesus, and despite it all, God being sovereign through it all, right? So this seems to me to be a deep and attested and justified reading of the verse, that one, renders God no longer a deceptive Loki style God figure, and two, we now can actually see a very deep intention, right? And it's very profound. The more I was looking at the parallels here in the story of Joseph and in Jesus, and it would make total sense for an author to use this approach that we're seeing exactly here as a way of making that point subtly. So far, I've rendered basically the full argument, which is, it's not totally concrete. It is to say simply that for this mocker root in question, specifically when we're looking at verses like this, where it's applying this root to Allah, it serves to reason, especially given what we've already established surrounding the textual tradition deriving from the Aramaic in primacy, that this should be read as this deep sense of that I laid out, instead of the very simple and restricted and I would say silly rendering that turns God into Satan. Because if someone said, my God is the best of deceivers, I would say, okay, so you're talking about Satan, right? And they say, no, I'm talking about Allah. Okay, I think you're reading the book wrong, right? Because if you're saying the God of Abraham is a deceiver, it seems to me you're probably reading the book wrong. And it's not the book's fault. It doesn't even say that in the book, but it's rather you using what quote unquote Arabic defines the word as sort of an ad hoc rendering. Anyway, so JC, what do you think about the case there? Is anything unclear?
I think it's actually very, very clear the way that you have explained it. So we have the story of Joseph and the story of Jesus. Both of them, they use this word. When we look at Joseph, we see clearly that he's actually sold into slavery. So his brothers mean him harm. And then the Quran hits us with with the same word again, saying, "Well, they macquer him." So okay, we know what that means. They sold him to the people going to Egypt, and things were going to be bad for him. And then but actually, Allah also did this thing, Makar. So those people did one action. They were, we would call it, if we wanted to be fast and loose with the words, scheme, as we have it now. Okay, so
Mhm.
they schemed to do something bad, but then God schemed also or planned to do something good. And he's, of course, always going to win because it's his plan all along. So that makes sense. And then when we take that to Jesus, to the story of Jesus, it's exactly the same thing. So they want to get rid of him. So they plan, they do these things, and but God has a better plan. So I guess maybe one of the problems is that it is translated as deceiver because that is the meaning in the Arabic. Also, that's how it is often translated in English, and when it's not translated as deceiver, it's translated in English as schemer. Those words are always negative. You never actually say to someone, "Oh, you're such a great schemer." It's like it's a very negative word, but it looks like the original doesn't have the negative word. That it really you would just understand when you listen someone using that word, you would know based on the context, which is something pretty much lost. And certainly, it wouldn't be an actual insult to God by calling him a deceiver. That would be a big one. So I think your explanation and this parallel makes things very, very clear. I hope that people watching have found this as well, like interesting, because this word is used, like you said at the beginning, by Christian apologists quite a lot. Like, how can you say that Allah is the best of the deceivers? Don't you know whose title that belongs to? And this is the reason. The original word actually didn't have these negative connotations. And in fact, it was in very short sentences, giving a lot of positive information, which any Christian or Jew would understand it in the meaning that it was originally intended. So they did this thing, it was bad, but then God did it and it was good. As opposed to how polarizing we are now with words, particularly in English, when one word is just completely negative. And hopefully we have sponged that from the record. So yeah, that has been very fascinating, Cash. Very well done, very well researched, and very well explained.
I appreciate it. That's very kind. So, I mean, obviously, this is just simply a pontification around Surah 3, verse 54. We This would be a better analysis would include also looking at every single verse and going through all of them in depth. However, for the scope of this presentation today, I figured we'd keep it a little bit more short. That way we can simply go through the root, put some nuance in regards to the meaning of this MKR root beyond just the Arabic as we're told today. And also keep in mind that what we're said is this is the meaning of the word in Arabic. Like I said in the beginning, we get that from Kitab al-Ain. That's already quite late. So it's an anachronism to assume that, let's say, the person who is an Arabic speaker who was reading this text at the time of the 7th century, the beginning of the 7th century, it would be false for us to assume that by necessity the Arabs who were Arabic speakers were understanding the MKR root as being deceive, plot, scheme, conspire. It's not necessarily the case that early 7th century Arabs understood the word like that. It's worth noting, right? So what I'm putting forward is that we have a little bit of nuance. We see that the meanings in the Syriac and in the Aramaic and in the Hebrew should inform us on how we understand this word, especially given how it's applied to both creation and creator. And to the point what you were saying about negative connotations, it does have negative connotations. It's just simply that the word can be used in multiple senses without, let's say, having a different spelling. It's the same root, it's the same word. It's simply you can use contextually in one context to say that they sold him into slavery effectively, or sold him out, or betrayed him, right? Drawing upon this echo of how it's used in the story of Joseph. However, you can use it at the same time, like in the other hand, you can fully use it in the positive sense of betrothing, right? So you can make a sale, you can transfer ownership in a good way, you can transfer ownership in a bad way, you can transfer ownership in a selfish way for your 30 silver coins to give out Jesus, or you can transfer ownership in a divine holy way, which is that to give your son up to the cross, to death, such that he can be betrothed to all that believe in him, right? So you have this thematic, you have this wider scope that you can understand the makar word as, and therefore, when you're looking at verses like this one, and also like the ones that use the makar word elsewhere, it'll give you a better understanding going in and how to interpret it. So, and like you were saying about how Christians just go with this, right? I think that this is, again, where it's a smokes and mirrors mistake that we're doing. I see the value in it in the sense that, okay, look, I'm just going to take you at face value. I'm going to do an internal critique based on how you view what your Quran says and so forth. But then you can get in an argument, about, who, the father or the best of the deceivers is actually Satan and this and that. But again, you're punching at things that aren't even in the text, right? Like the Quran isn't even talking about this. You're fighting against traditions, and fighting against traditions is just you're gonna punch them out, and then they're gonna rely on another tradition, and you're gonna start hammering away at that tradition about its logical consistency, historical accuracy, or whatever. But you're exhausting yourself without ever getting to the core, which is, well, does it even really say that in the text? Like I get it. Like you're telling me that the God you worship is a deceiver. Like I get that you're telling me that. But is that even what the text itself is trying to get at? Is that really what the text itself is saying? It's like, sure, if you have the standard Islamic narrative of, effectively God deceiving the entire Christian world by, putting on this movie of the crucifixion and deceiving everyone, presumably, like in that context, sure, then the God you worship, is conceivably a deceiver or a plotter. But not if we're understanding God as he's been talked about and as he's been defined all the way through from the beginning to Jesus, right? Through the prophets and so on. So that's effectively it. I think that it's nice to just sort of go through one word, have a little presentation, and then as we go along, we want to be maybe looking at other roots, looking at words like shirk, like kafir. Look at these other roots that are theologically significant. Even Adon, which we'll eventually look at Adon, because it's talking about the ear of God, right? That's what is told to us. It means that Jesus performed a miracle with the permission of God. That's the way they translate it. The word actually means ear. It doesn't have this direct scope of permission. It's actually talking in a more mystical sense that Jesus performed the miracle through the ear of God, as in, the same way, that God's ear is fully receptive towards him. Therefore, he can ask God to perform a miracle, and he will. That's the kind of the idea. It effectively subordinates Jesus as, he had God's ear fully. Technically, you could too, presumably. So it sort of makes this performing of Jesus's miracles not inherent to him, which is a subordination. Anyway, we're going to go into other routes in the future, and I hope everyone enjoyed today's exploration.
Like Kash said, the next shows will be mostly about different routes, different words, but we have other things as well, like lined up. We have other people who are going to come in and actually show us other things that they have noticed in the Quran. So that should be interesting as well, having different people here on the show. And let us know if you have any particular words or sections or stories in the Quran that either you have figured out the answer or you think that requires some exploration. Let us know in the comment section. So maybe there are things that we have it on our to-do list, but maybe there are things that we haven't even considered for a second, and you tell us, we can write it down, and at one point we will get through those. And if you have figured out any of these very mysterious stories that nobody seems to know what they're talking about, perhaps through mistranslations from Syriac or whatever it may be, or the interpretation or diacritics or anything else, let us know, and maybe you'll get to come on the channel and actually show us all, so that we all know and we don't get to reinvent the wheel. So that is what will be happening in the coming weeks. The next time we'll probably be here on Thursday, inshallah.
Inshallah. Yes,
Yeah.
we'll probably do Thursday. Do we know what the topic is yet, JC, or
No, let's actually discuss as to what we're going to discuss on that day. But we will be back hopefully on Thursday if everything goes well, and hopefully we will have another very exciting topic that will clarify something interesting in the Quran. So until then, we are, I think, probably to call it a day. Kash, would you like to say some final words?
Thank you everyone for your attention, and I really appreciate all the comments, and engaging in the material is super exciting. It inspires me, it gives me motivation to work harder, and I look forward to, like you were suggesting, anyone who is engaging with the material, who really is passionate about this. We would absolutely love to have you on the platform, have a discussion about whatever you find you found something maybe that's interesting, worth investigating. We would love to have in a spontaneous manner, anytime, to jump on and have a quick stream, talk about it. We'll be doing Mondays and Thursdays as a sort of a standard schedule at 6 o'clock European Standard Time. I'm not totally sure the number there. Well, that's correct. But anyway, so we're going to have a schedule of Monday and Thursday as a regular scheduled programming. And then it would be really great if we could also do some extra streams with anyone who thinks that they have something worthwhile investigating and discussing.
Right, very exciting times. So until this Thursday, thank you all for watching. Thank you everyone for being here, for the likes, the shares, the subs, and all of that. Hopefully, we will manage to reach more people with your support. And God bless you all. And remember, we are the Crusades. See you soon. Bye bye.
Bye bye.